The story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives is one of passion, power, betrayal, and survival. A saga that has fascinated people for centuries. These women were more than just queens. They were players in a high-stakes drama that shaped the course of English history. Their lives were marked by love and ambition, loyalty and heartbreak, courage and tragedy. Behind the grand titles and royal ceremonies lay struggles for identity, influence, and survival in a world ruled by a king whose desires could change the fate of a nation. Exploring their stories reveals not only the personal dramas of a turbulent court but also timeless truths about power, gender, and resilience. Henry VIII remains one of history's most iconic monarchs, not only for his political and religious upheavals but for the extraordinary drama of his personal life. His reign, which began in 1509 and spanned nearly 4 decades, marked a turning point in English history. It was during this time that England broke from the Roman Catholic Church, ushering in the English Reformation, a change driven in no small part by Henry's need to control his marital destiny. To understand the stories of his 6 wives is to explore not just a sequence of marriages but a deep and often disturbing portrait of love, power, betrayal, and obsession. Henry's early reign was filled with promise. Athletic, intelligent, charismatic, and fluent in several languages, he was a king who was celebrated for his youthful vigor and commitment to the ideals of Renaissance monarchy. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay an insecure man, increasingly consumed by the weight of dynastic pressure. His father, Henry VII, had secured the throne through conquest, ending decades of civil strife in the Wars of the Roses. It was now Henry VIII's burden to preserve that peace by ensuring the continuity of the Tudor line. More than anything, he craved a legitimate male heir. This fixation on succession would come to define, and ultimately destabilize, his reign. The early years of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon were marked by affection and political unity. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and their union had the backing of both papal approval and mutual respect. However, as years passed without a surviving son, Henry's anxiety intensified. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and the tragic early deaths of children shook the royal couple. Only one child, Princess Mary, survived infancy. To Henry, the absence of a male heir wasn't just personal disappointment, it was a threat to national stability. He came to believe that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, citing biblical passages to support the idea that taking his brother's widow had been against divine law. This growing conviction sparked his relentless campaign to annul the marriage, setting in motion events that would shake Europe. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry defied Rome, severed ties with the Catholic Church, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This act was not merely political or religious, it was also deeply personal. It was rooted in his desperate need to control his marital future and to remarry in pursuit of a male heir. Henry's redefinition of religious authority in England was driven by his vision of love and loyalty as tools of statecraft. Yet what did love mean to Henry? Was it a genuine emotional connection or a mechanism to achieve his political goals? With each subsequent marriage, Henry seemed to blur the line between affection and ambition. His love could be intense, even obsessive, but just as swiftly, it could sour. When his wives failed to meet his expectations, whether by not producing sons or by challenging his authority, he often viewed them as having betrayed him. In truth, Henry was the consistent betrayer, of his vows, of the women he claimed to love, and of the moral codes he once upheld. The concept of betrayal took on many forms under his reign: infidelity, disobedience, political inconvenience, all punishable by annulment, exile, or execution. Publicly, Henry framed his actions as justified responses to his wives' failings. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he appended an entire church, was later accused of adultery and treason and beheaded. Catherine Howard, a teenager surrounded by political enemies and trapped in a court rife with surveillance, met the same fate. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour, who gave Henry the son he longed for, died in childbirth and was later venerated by the king as his true wife. These narratives weren't just personal stories, they were state propaganda, shaped by Henry's desire to protect his image and legacy. Over time, the stories of Henry's wives became distorted by myth and dramatization. Catherine of Aragon was reduced to a bitter old woman, and Bullen caricatured as a scheming seductress, and Catherine Howard remembered primarily for her sexual missteps. These simplified portrayals obscured the nuanced realities of their lives. Their intelligence, their agency, limited though it was, their political influence, and the deeply human experiences they endured. It is tempting to view them merely as victims or villains, but such perspectives ignore the broader context of Tudor power politics, religious upheaval, and the ruthless environment of the royal court. The way history remembers these women is often filtered through Henry's lens, through the declarations of his court, the official records he sanctioned, and the narratives crafted to justify his actions. As a result, centuries of historiography have been shaped by a man who used marriage as a weapon and betrayal as a justification. In recent decades, however, historians and biographers have begun to reclaim these women's voices, uncovering letters, diplomatic accounts, and private correspondences that offer deeper insight into their characters and circumstances. Uncovering the truth behind Henry VIII's marriages requires more than recounting who married whom, and in what order. It involves questioning the very foundations of how we define love and loyalty, especially in a time when royal marriages were political contracts as much as emotional unions. In Henry's world, loyalty was transactional, and betrayal was whatever he declared it to be. His wives, each in their own way, were caught in this shifting tide of royal favor, religious reformation, and personal ambition. Understanding Henry's motivations, and the consequences for the women he married, is essential to understanding the broader history of Tudor England. His reign was not just shaped by wars, laws, and reforms, but by the intimate, often brutal dynamics of his marital life. It is a story not only of a powerful king, but of 6 remarkable women whose fates were intertwined with one man's relentless pursuit of a legacy. Their lives were defined not solely by their deaths or divorces, but by their resilience, intellect, and courage in the face of a monarch who wielded both love and betrayal with deadly precision. Catherine of Aragon, the loyal queen cast aside. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, was born into one of the most powerful and devout royal families of Renaissance Europe. The youngest surviving child of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, she was raised in a deeply Catholic household where piety, duty, and royal honor were central to identity and upbringing. From an early age, Catherine was groomed for queenship. Fluent in Latin, educated in philosophy, theology, and history, she was well equipped for the political and religious responsibilities of monarchy. Her early years were marked by a sense of destiny, one forged by her parents' vision of uniting Christian kingdoms against Muslim rule and strengthening Spain's ties across Europe. England was part of that vision. At age 15, Catherine was married to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII. This marriage was arranged to solidify the Anglo-Spanish alliance. However, tragedy struck only a few months into their union when Arthur died in 1502. Widowed so young, Catherine's position became precarious. For several years, she remained in England under uncertain circumstances, a diplomatic pawn between 2 monarchies. Whether her marriage to Arthur had been consummated became a critical point of contention later in her life. Catherine consistently swore it had not, a declaration that would become essential when her second marriage, to Arthur's younger brother Henry, was questioned decades later. In 1509, after the death of Henry VII, Catherine married the newly crowned Henry VIII. At first, their relationship appeared affectionate and solid. Henry was just 17, charismatic, handsome, and eager to establish his rule. Catherine, already 23, brought with her experience, political savvy, and a strong understanding of royal protocol. Their union was well received both at home and abroad. For the first few years, the marriage thrived. Catherine fulfilled her role as queen with grace, acting as Henry's advisor and occasionally even serving as regent in his absence, most notably during the 1513 campaign in France. In one celebrated incident, she rode out in armor to rally troops against a Scottish invasion while Henry was abroad. Her loyalty to England and her commitment to her husband were undeniable. However, the couple's shared happiness was tested by a series of personal tragedies that would ultimately reshape English history. Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. The repeated loss of children devastated the royal couple and stoked public and political anxiety. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, survived infancy. The lack of a male heir cast a shadow over Catherine's queenship and sowed doubt in Henry's mind about the validity of their marriage. As time passed and Catherine aged, her chances of bearing more children diminished. For Henry, this was not just a personal disappointment but a dynastic crisis. The Tudor line, barely a generation old, was vulnerable without a male successor. Henry, whose ego and insecurities had grown with time, began to believe that his union with Catherine was cursed by God. He cited Levitical scripture suggesting that a man who marries his brother's widow will be childless, a claim he used to argue for the annulment of his marriage. Yet Catherine remained resolute. She insisted her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and therefore her marriage to Henry was lawful in the eyes of both Church and God. Her resistance was more than personal. It was ideological and political. As a devout Catholic, she refused to acknowledge Henry's authority to overrule the Pope, who had originally granted the dispensation for their marriage. Her refusal to quietly disappear or accept the annulment caused a major international and religious scandal. She fought Henry's attempts to discard her with fierce determination, defending her daughter's legitimacy and her own dignity as queen. Catherine's stance was admired across Europe, particularly in her native Spain and among English Catholics, but it also further enraged Henry, who was already enthralled by Anne Boleyn, a younger woman who offered the promise of both sexual allure and the possibility of a male heir. Anne Boleyn's influence over Henry grew in tandem with Catherine's diminishing favor. Unlike Catherine, Anne was politically astute, provocative, and Protestant-leaning. She refused to become Henry's mistress, holding out for marriage and forcing him into a 6-year campaign to dissolve his marriage to Catherine. This campaign ultimately led to England's break from the Roman Catholic Church. Frustrated by the Pope's refusal to grant an annulment, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, granting himself the power to annul his marriage. In 1533, he married Anne Boleyn in secret, declaring his union with Catherine null and void. Catherine, however, never accepted this verdict. She continued to refer to herself as Henry's lawful wife and Mary as his legitimate heir. Despite being banished from court, moved between increasingly isolated residences, and cut off from contact with her daughter, she held her ground with unshakable dignity. Her final years were marked by illness, isolation, and unwavering devotion to her faith and her daughter. She was subjected to great emotional cruelty, forbidden from seeing Mary and stripped of her titles, yet she refused to concede. Her letters from this period reveal a woman of extraordinary fortitude and clarity of purpose. Her death in 1536, likely from cancer, marked the end of one of the most controversial royal relationships in English history. Even as her body was interred with little ceremony in Peterborough Abbey, she retained the admiration of many across Europe. In death, as in life, she was seen by many as a queen unjustly discarded. Henry did not attend her funeral, nor did Mary, who was barred from doing so. Catherine's final letter to Henry, reportedly signed, "The Queen," expressed forgiveness and eternal love, a final act of grace from a woman whose loyalty never wavered. Catherine of Aragon's legacy is profound. Her fierce defense of her marriage and her daughter's rights laid the foundation for Mary I's later reign. She became a symbol of resistance to tyranny and an icon of steadfastness in the face of political betrayal. While later propaganda, particularly under Protestant rulers, sought to diminish her role and justify Henry's actions, modern historians have increasingly recognized her political intelligence, moral courage, and personal strength. The betrayal Catherine endured was not just a matter of love lost but of systemic humiliation and forced erasure from public life. Yet she never allowed herself to be erased. Through her defiance, she carved out a powerful legacy. She fought not only for herself and her daughter, but also for the principle that truth and conscience were more sacred than power. In an era when women were expected to be silent, submissive, and disposable, Catherine of Aragon stood firm as a queen, a mother, and a woman of faith, loyal to the end, cast aside, but never defeated. Anne Boleyn, the temptress or the target. Anne Boleyn remains one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in English history. She has been vilified as a manipulative seductress, celebrated as a revolutionary queen, and mourned as a tragic victim of court politics and royal caprice. To understand Anne's complex legacy, it is essential to look beyond the myths and examine the life of a woman who played a central role in reshaping the religious and political landscape of England. Her story is not merely a tale of romantic ambition or courtly intrigue, but one of intellect, power, and ultimately, betrayal. Anne's early years were spent far from the English court, in the cultured circles of continental Europe. Born around 1501 into the ambitious Bullen family, she was the daughter of Thomas Bullen and Lady Elizabeth Howard. Her father, a skilled diplomat, ensured that Anne and her sister Mary received elite educations. As a young girl, Anne was sent to the Netherlands to serve Margaret of Austria, a renowned patron of learning and humanism. There, Anne was introduced to the sophistication of Renaissance courts, absorbing languages, etiquette, and ideas that would shape her personality and worldview. She later moved to France, where she served Queen Claude and was exposed to the lively intellectual climate of the French court. The years spent abroad transformed Anne into a highly educated, cosmopolitan young woman fluent in French and well-versed in music, poetry, theology, and fashion. Her time in Europe imbued her with a sharp wit and a confident demeanor that would distinguish her when she returned to England. Anne's entrance into English court life occurred during the reign of Henry VIII, and she quickly gained notice for her charm and style. She did not conform to the standard mold of beauty at the time. She had dark eyes and an olive complexion, but her allure was undeniable. Unlike her sister Mary, who had briefly been one of Henry's mistresses, and refused to become his paramour, she instead played a more strategic game, skillfully navigating court politics and presenting herself as a woman of virtue and intelligence. Her refusal to yield to the king's desires intrigued Henry, who was used to immediate compliance. Anne's determination to remain chaste until marriage only increased her desirability in Henry's eyes. Their relationship evolved over time from flirtation to infatuation, and eventually, obsession. Henry's pursuit of and coincided with a growing dissatisfaction in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and meanwhile, did not simply play the passive object of royal affection. She became a shrewd political player, encouraging Henry's efforts to obtain an annulment from Catherine and aligning herself with reformist factions in court. She began to champion ideas associated with the Protestant Reformation, including criticisms of papal authority and the promotion of scripture in the vernacular. While there is debate over the depth of her theological convictions, Anne was undoubtedly instrumental in advancing the cause of religious reform. Her influence helped introduce Henry to thinkers such as William Tyndale and supported the distribution of English translations of the Bible. Anne's role in the English Reformation cannot be overstated. While Henry's break from Rome was primarily driven by his desire for a male heir and his frustration with papal resistance, Anne provided the ideological and emotional fuel for that rupture. In 1533, after years of tension and maneuvering, Henry declared his marriage to Catherine invalid and secretly wed Anne. Shortly thereafter, she was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony. Her rise to power was meteoric and deeply polarizing. She had replaced a popular queen and was widely perceived as the cause of the nation's religious schism. Many at court, including staunch Catholics and supporters of Catherine, viewed her with suspicion and disdain. As queen, Anne wielded considerable influence. She used her position to promote reformist clergy and to advance the interests of her family and allies. However, her reign was fraught with challenges. Most pressing was her inability to provide Henry with the long-desired male heir. In 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a disappointment to Henry but a child who would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. Subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, deepening Henry's disillusionment. As Anne's political enemies gained ground, her failure to produce a son became a liability that weakened her position. Anne's assertive nature and political involvement, which had initially captivated Henry, began to irritate him. Unlike Catherine, who had quietly resisted Henry's attempts to discard her, and was outspoken, emotional, and sometimes confrontational, she clashed with members of the court, including Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Cromwell, who had once been her ally in bringing about the Reformation, began to see her as an obstacle to his own ambitions. Their relationship deteriorated over issues of patronage, foreign policy, and control over church wealth. Cromwell recognized that Anne's downfall could benefit both his political agenda and his standing with the increasingly frustrated king. In early 1536, Anne suffered a miscarriage, losing a child believed to be male. The timing was disastrous. By then, Henry had begun to fixate on one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who presented herself as modest and obedient, everything and was not. Cromwell seized the opportunity to orchestrate Anne's removal. What followed was one of the most shocking and rapid falls from grace in English royal history. In May of that year, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were sensational and, in many respects, implausible. Among the accused were several men from court, including Anne's own brother, George Bullen. The charges against Anne appear to have been fabricated or exaggerated. Contemporary accounts and later historical analyses suggest that the evidence was flimsy and that many of the alleged liaisons were chronologically impossible. Nonetheless, the court was rigged against her, and was tried before a jury of nobles, many of whom were hostile to her or indebted to Cromwell. Despite her eloquent defense and lack of concrete proof, she was found guilty. The political necessity of her removal overrode any concern for fairness or justice. On May 19, 1536, she was executed by sword at the Tower of London. Her death was swift but deeply symbolic, a warning to those who overstepped their role in a court ruled by a capricious king. The image of Anne Boleyn has been shaped and reshaped over the centuries. In her own time, she was vilified as a homewrecker, a heretic, and a witch. Propagandists painted her as a dangerous temptress who had bewitched the king and led the nation into religious chaos. These narratives were perpetuated by her enemies and cemented by later Catholic historians, who saw her as emblematic of the Protestant betrayal of the true church. The idea of Anne as a villainous seductress dominated for generations, casting a long shadow over her legacy. Yet more recent interpretations have challenged these characterizations. Modern historians have re-examined the political and gender dynamics of Anne's life, portraying her not as a scheming manipulator but as a complex woman navigating a treacherous court. She has been reimagined as a reformer, a proto-feminist figure who used her intelligence and influence in a male-dominated world. Her patronage of religious reformers, her support for the poor, and her encouragement of education suggest a broader vision than mere personal ambition. Rather than a seductress, she emerges as a target, an intelligent, opinionated woman who threatened the established order and paid the ultimate price. The debate over Anne Boleyn's character reveals as much about changing historical perspectives as it does about Anne herself. For centuries, her story has been shaped by those with agendas, be it religious, political, or ideological. As our understanding of gender, power, and historiography evolves, so too does our appreciation of and as a figure of both great agency and great tragedy. Her story is one of rise and fall, of power gained and power lost, but also of enduring impact. She may have died disgraced and discarded, but her daughter Elizabeth would ascend the throne and rule for over 4 decades, a living testament to Anne's lasting influence. Anne Boleyn defies easy categorization. She was ambitious, yes, but also visionary. She made enemies, but she also inspired devotion. She provoked a king to defy an empire, yet she could not protect herself from the political forces she helped unleash. Her life and death exposed the brutal realities of Tudor court politics, where love, loyalty, and ambition were entangled with danger and betrayal. Whether viewed as temptress or target, Anne Boleyn remains a central figure in the drama of Henry VIII's reign, not just for the role she played in history, but for the questions her life continues to provoke. Jane Seymour, the gentle peacemaker. Jane Seymour's place in the turbulent saga of Henry VIII's 6 wives is often seen as understated, yet her significance in the broader narrative of Tudor history is profound. She came into Henry's life at a moment of crisis, immediately following the scandalous fall and execution of Anne Boleyn. In contrast to the fiery and politically ambitious Anne, Jane presented herself as demure, obedient, and pious, the perfect antidote to the disorder that had defined the king's previous marriage. Her quiet demeanor, noble birth, and restrained public image made her seem like a balm to Henry's ego and a symbol of restored dignity to the English monarchy. Born around 1508 to Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, Jane came from a well-established noble family. The Seymours were not among the most powerful or politically dominant houses, but they were respected and well-connected. Jane was raised with traditional values, emphasizing religious devotion, domestic skills, and female modesty. Unlike Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, Jane did not receive a robust humanist education. She was not fluent in Latin or known for intellectual prowess, but her skills in needlework and household management were highly praised, and her character was considered virtuous and mild. These traits, in many ways, defined the image she would project as queen. Jane served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, which gave her first-hand insight into the volatility of Henry's court and the personal costs of being queen. By the time she caught Henry's attention, she had already seen how ambition and passion could destroy a woman in the Tudor world. Jane's courtship with Henry began even before Anne Boleyn's death, and she was likely groomed by conservative factions at court, those who opposed Anne's religious radicalism and who yearned for a return to traditional values. Jane was positioned as the embodiment of female virtue, silent, loyal, and fertile. Her demeanor was always measured. She did not encourage scandal, nor did she flaunt her relationship with the king while Anne still lived. When Henry's affections turned toward her, she reportedly refused to become his mistress, insisting on marriage if he truly sought her. The timing of their union was startlingly swift. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536. The very next day, Henry was betrothed to Jane, and they were married 10 days later. This rapid transition suggests not only Henry's desperation for a male heir but also the meticulous planning of Jane's backers, particularly her ambitious brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour. To the public and the court, Jane's arrival was meant to signify moral restoration and political stability. Her appearance and demeanor reinforced the image. She wore modest clothing, avoided extravagant displays, and took on a maternal role with Princess Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, attempting to heal the emotional wounds left by the previous reign. While she succeeded in bringing Mary back into Henry's good graces, she never exercised the kind of political influence her predecessors had. This may have been her choice or a condition imposed by Henry, who by then had grown weary of assertive queens. In many ways, Jane Seymour was crafted to be the perfect queen, not by strength of will or brilliance of mind, but by embodying the traditional expectations of femininity that Henry so desperately craved. Her conservative image was a powerful political tool. She was associated with Catholic sympathies and reconciliation, which helped placate conservative factions unsettled by Henry's religious changes. While she never openly challenged the Church of England or Henry's role as its head, she also never promoted radical reform. She was a safe middle ground, a queen who seemed to support order, obedience, and lineage above all else. Jane's true moment of triumph came in October 1537, when she gave birth to a long-awaited male heir. Prince Edward's birth was not only a personal victory for Jane, but also a national celebration. Henry finally had his son, legitimate, healthy, and the continuation of the Tudor line. The public rejoiced, and Jane's status soared. For a brief moment, she held the greatest political currency a queen of the time could possess, the mother of a male heir. Her success fulfilled the very reason Anne Boleyn had been cast aside and Catherine of Aragon rejected. It validated Henry's choices and seemed to confirm Jane as divinely favored. But this triumph came at a grave cost. Jane never recovered from the complications of childbirth. Within days of Edward's birth, she fell ill, likely due to puerperal fever, a common and often fatal postpartum infection in the 16th century. Despite her attendants' efforts, her condition worsened, and on October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth, Jane died. Her passing deeply affected Henry. Though he had discarded or condemned his previous wives, he mourned Jane sincerely. Her death, so closely tied to the birth of his only legitimate son, sealed her image as the ideal Tudor queen, self-sacrificing, dutiful, and victorious in death. Henry's treatment of Jane's memory stands in stark contrast to his treatment of his other wives. He referred to her as his true wife, and it was with Jane that he chose to be buried, requesting to lie beside her in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. This act was not simply a sign of affection, it was a political message. By idealizing Jane, Henry reinforced his vision of monarchy, one in which obedience, loyalty, and childbearing were rewarded, even in death. Jane became the model against which all future wives were judged, and her brothers capitalized on this elevation. The Seymours rose rapidly in power, with her brother Edward eventually becoming Lord Protector during Edward VI's minority. Her short reign as queen thus had lasting political ramifications, not only in terms of dynastic continuity but in shaping the course of the Tudor court after her death. Despite her brief time as queen, Jane Seymour's legacy remains significant. Historians have long debated whether she was a woman of quiet strength or merely a pawn used by others to gain power. On the surface, Jane appears passive. She did not challenge Henry, she did not push her own political agenda, and she largely stayed out of court disputes. Yet there are moments that suggest she was not without agency. Her efforts to reconcile Henry with Mary, though subtle, required diplomatic skill and courage, particularly in a court where past queens had been disgraced for political involvement. Furthermore, her ability to maintain her image of virtue amid a court steeped in gossip and maneuvering points to a keen awareness of how to navigate the dangers of royal life. That said, Jane's legacy has often been constructed by others rather than by her own voice. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon, Jane left behind no letters or recorded speeches that might offer deeper insight into her thoughts or motivations. As a result, her identity has often been shaped by the needs of those who came after her. Henry, who needed to justify the sacrifices made in pursuit of a son; Edward, who ruled under the name of a mother he never knew; and Protestant historians, who sought to frame her as a symbol of divine providence. She became a blank canvas onto which the ideal of Tudor queenship could be projected. In the grand narrative of Henry VIII's wives, Jane Seymour stands out not for drama or tragedy, but for a brief, almost serene chapter of success followed by sudden death. Her role was foundational, providing Henry the heir he had sought through political upheaval and personal cruelty. She emerged at a moment when the monarchy needed stability and fulfilled that need with grace, even if fleetingly. Though she lived in the shadow of more prominent queens, her impact was just as enduring. Jane's strength may not have been loud or forceful, but in a court where survival often depended on silence and timing, her quiet composure proved to be her greatest power. Anne of Cleves, the unwanted bride. Anne of Cleves is often remembered through the lens of Henry VIII's disappointment, an image rooted more in anecdote and court gossip than in the fuller truth of her life. She was the fourth wife of Henry, married for just a few months before the union was annulled. While history has sometimes reduced her to the role of a mismatched bride in an unfortunate political arrangement, a deeper look reveals a woman of resilience, pragmatism, and quiet intelligence who navigated a humiliating situation with remarkable composure. Her story, though brief in the annals of Tudor queenship, is a striking example of how diplomacy, adaptability, and grace could turn apparent failure into lifelong stability. Anne was born in 1515 into the Duchy of Cleves, a strategically located territory within the Holy Roman Empire. Her family held Protestant sympathies, which made them attractive allies for England in the face of the growing Catholic threat from Charles V of Spain and Francis I of France. By the late 1530s, England was diplomatically isolated after Henry's break with Rome. Seeking to bolster his position, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and architect of the English Reformation, arranged a marriage alliance with the Protestant German states. Anne of Cleves, the daughter of Duke John III, was selected as the most suitable bride to help forge this alliance. Political motivations, not romantic inclinations, were at the heart of the match. Before proposing marriage, Henry demanded a portrait of Anne. The famed artist Hans Holbein the Younger was dispatched to Cleves to paint her likeness. Holbein, an astute court painter who understood the political implications of his work, portrayed Anne with care and flattery. The resulting image showed a composed and attractive woman, dressed in rich but modest clothing, with delicate features and a serene expression. When Henry saw the portrait, he was pleased, convinced that Anne would be a fitting queen both in appearance and in purpose. Encouraged by Cromwell and reassured by the painting, Henry agreed to the match. However, the marriage began to unravel the moment Anne arrived in England. Her journey across the Channel was celebrated with pomp, but tension arose as soon as Henry met her in person. Eager to surprise his bride, Henry disguised himself and entered her room unannounced. Anne, unfamiliar with English customs and unaware of who the disguised man was, did not react with the deference or affection Henry expected. Offended and disappointed, Henry quickly decided that he found her unattractive and unsuitable. He famously complained that she looked nothing like her portrait and later described her disparagingly, although such comments may have had more to do with justifying his actions than with reality. Despite this rocky start, the marriage went ahead for political reasons. On January 6, 1540, Henry and Anne were married in a quiet ceremony. Yet the king remained emotionally and physically distant. He later claimed that he could not consummate the marriage, citing his lack of attraction. Within weeks, Henry was already seeking a way out. Cromwell, who had championed the match, fell from favor and was eventually executed, his political fortunes directly tied to the failure of this union. By July of that year, the marriage was officially annulled on the grounds of non-consummation and Anne's pre-contract to another noble, which provided the legal pretext for ending the alliance without public scandal. The end of the marriage could have been disastrous for Anne. She was a foreign princess in a strange court, publicly rejected by the most powerful man in the country. Yet her response demonstrated extraordinary political sensitivity and emotional intelligence. Rather than protest or demand reinstatement, and accepted the annulment with grace. She agreed to the title King's Sister, a unique designation that allowed her to remain in England with her dignity intact. In return, she received a generous financial settlement, including multiple estates, a household of her own, and precedence over all women at court except the reigning queen and Henry's daughters. Anne's decision to accept her new role instead of resisting was a masterstroke. It ensured her safety, preserved her status, and won her Henry's lasting goodwill. He reportedly came to like Anne more after their annulment than during their short marriage, often inviting her to court and granting her lavish gifts. While she never returned to the center of political life, she was treated with respect and remained close to the royal family. She maintained a good relationship with Henry's children, particularly Mary and Elizabeth, and was present at important court events. Unlike the fates that befell some of Henry's other wives, execution, exile, disgrace, and lived in comfort and stability for the remainder of her life. Her post-marital life stands in sharp contrast to the tragic fates of Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. While those women were swept up in the dangerous dynamics of Henry's affections and courtly intrigue, and of Clevy's carefully avoided scandal, her retreat from the throne did not mean obscurity. It marked a rare moment of self-preservation and adaptability in an era when royal women had few choices and little power. She did not attempt to leverage her position to return to power, nor did she align herself with factions at court that might threaten Henry's interests. She simply lived, and by doing so she survived. Despite her successful adaptation, Anne of Cleves has often been misunderstood. Popular accounts have painted her as plain, awkward, or unintelligent, narratives largely based on Henry's dismissive comments and the English court's xenophobia. Cultural differences between Anne and her English contemporaries contributed to these perceptions. She was raised in a formal conservative household where courtly love and flirtation were not encouraged. She spoke little English upon her arrival and had no experience with the refined arts of dancing, music, or witty conversation that were prized in Henry's court. This lack of polish was interpreted as dullness or backwardness, but it was more a matter of cultural misalignment than any personal failing. In truth, Anne appears to have had a practical and gentle personality. She adapted quickly to her new environment, learned English, and established a respectable household. She cultivated a reputation for generosity and dignity, showing none of the bitterness one might expect from someone so publicly humiliated. Over time, historians have begun to reevaluate her legacy, recognizing her as a capable and resilient woman who turned potential ruin into lasting security. Her story invites a reassessment of what it means to be successful in a court defined by danger, desire, and deceit. Anne of Cleves died in 1557, outliving Henry and all his other wives. She was buried with honors in Westminster Abbey, a final mark of respect for a woman who had once been cast aside, but who left the world with her dignity and reputation intact. Though her time as queen was short, the impact of her life and the manner in which she navigated a hostile and unpredictable court endure as a testament to her intelligence and resilience. Far from being simply the unwanted bride, Anne of Cleves offers a compelling portrait of survival and quiet strength. Her marriage to Henry may have been a diplomatic failure, but her response to that failure was a personal triumph. She managed to transform a moment of rejection into a life of independence, security, and grace, an achievement that makes her one of the most quietly remarkable women of the Tudor age. Catherine Howard, the tragic teen bride. Catherine Howard's story is one of the most tragic among Henry VIII's 6 wives, marked by youth, manipulation, and the ruthless politics of the Tudor court. Her brief rise and dramatic fall highlight the vulnerability of women in a world where power dynamics, reputation, and royal favor could dictate life or death. Though she was queen for less than 2 years, her life and death reflect the dangerous intersection of youthful naivety and courtly ambition. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who wielded political influence and shaped religious transformation, Catherine was barely more than a teenager when she was thrust into the spotlight, ill-prepared for the scrutiny and expectations that came with marrying a king. Catherine was born around 1523, the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the powerful Howard family. Though of noble birth, her branch of the family lived in relative obscurity and financial hardship. Her father's position was precarious, and Catherine's early years were marked by instability. She was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where she received an informal and often unsupervised upbringing. The Howard family had ambitions of restoring their influence at court, and placing a girl in proximity to royal favor was a calculated move in their broader strategy. Catherine's upbringing, however, did little to prepare her for the demands of queenship. She was not given a rigorous education like Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. Instead, she grew up in a large and often chaotic household, where noble wards and servants mingled with little oversight. Within this environment, Catherine developed flirtations and relationships that would later return to haunt her. It was during these formative years that she engaged in intimate relations with Francis Derham, a man of lower status but significant influence in the Duchess's household. Though these interactions were not uncommon in such loosely supervised settings, they would later be construed as evidence of moral corruption. Catherine's beauty and charm were apparent from an early age. She was lively, graceful, and appealing, traits that made her attractive to the aging King Henry VIII when she arrived at court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. Henry, by this time, was in his late 40s, increasingly obese, plagued by ulcers and chronic pain, and emotionally volatile. His marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a political disaster, and he was humiliated by its failure. Catherine, young and vivacious, seemed to offer everything and did not. She was affectionate, flirtatious, and attentive. Their courtship was swift. Henry was besotted, describing her as a rose without a thorn. For the king, she represented a renewal of youth, a fantasy of romantic vitality. For Catherine, the attention of the king offered an escape from her family's financial uncertainty and a path to prestige, though it also carried immense risk. The marriage took place on July 28, 1540, just weeks after Henry's annulment from Anne of Cleves. Catherine was likely around 17 years old. Henry was nearly 50. Their union was celebrated with lavish court entertainments, and Catherine's position as queen was immediately secured. Yet beneath the surface, their relationship was built on fragile illusions. While Henry doted on his new bride, giving her extravagant gifts and parading her as a symbol of royal vigor, Catherine found herself increasingly isolated, constrained by the role she was expected to play. The age gap, the difference in experience, and the pressure to produce an heir all added strain to their marriage. It wasn't long before scandal began to surface. Court rumors swirled about Catherine's past, particularly her relationship with Francis Derham. Emboldened by his former intimacy with the Queen, Derham sought a position in her household, believing he had a claim to her favor. Catherine's decision to employ him as a secretary, a choice likely influenced by fear or coercion, proved to be a critical mistake. Even more perilous was her ongoing relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. Whether this relationship was emotional, physical, or both remains debated, but their meetings, aided by Lady Rochford and Boleyn's sister-in-law, were enough to provoke suspicion. The combination of her past with Derham and the alleged affair with Culpeper painted a damning picture. In the Tudor court, nothing remained secret for long. By the autumn of 1541, Catherine's enemies, particularly those who had resented the Howard family's resurgence, began to investigate. Archbishop Cranmer, a key figure in Henry's inner circle, presented the king with a letter detailing the allegations. Henry was devastated. The betrayal cut deeply, not only because of personal humiliation but because it cast doubt on his ability to choose and control his queens. His fantasy of Catherine as an innocent and loving bride crumbled into bitterness and fury. An intense investigation followed. Derham and Culpeper were both arrested and interrogated under torture. They confessed to varying degrees of involvement, and letters from Catherine to Culpeper were presented as evidence of infidelity. These letters, whether sincere expressions of affection or forced under duress, further implicated her. Catherine herself was interrogated but lacked the experience or support to navigate the legal and political nightmare that followed. She initially denied any wrongdoing, but eventually, under pressure, she admitted to past indiscretions with Derham and a close relationship with Culpeper. Her admissions were used to construct a narrative of deception and betrayal. The charges against Catherine were severe. She was accused of leading a dissolute life before marriage and of committing adultery while queen, acts deemed treasonous under English law. The public was shocked. Once again, Henry's court was thrown into scandal. Catherine was stripped of her title and confined to Syon Abbey. Meanwhile, Derham and Culpeper were executed in December 1541. Derham by the horrific method of hanging, drawing and quartering, Culpeper by beheading. Their brutal deaths were meant to serve as a warning about betraying the king's trust. Catherine's fate was sealed in early 1542. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her, eliminating the need for a formal trial. The bill declared her guilty of treason and sentenced her to death. In her final days, she was said to be inconsolable, consumed by fear and grief. On February 13, 1542, she was taken to the Tower of London, where she faced execution. Reports claim she asked for the execution block to be brought to her beforehand so she could practice placing her head upon it, an eerie testament to the trauma and isolation she endured. At approximately 19 years old, she was beheaded on Tower Green, the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had met her end just 6 years earlier. Catherine's death sparked debate both in her time and in the centuries that followed. Some viewed her as foolish, reckless, and morally weak. Others saw her as a victim of political exploitation and court corruption. Her youth, lack of education, and the pressure placed upon her by the Howard family all contributed to her downfall. Unlike Anne Boleyn, Catherine had no ideological mission or political ambition. She was a pawn, groomed for favor, and discarded when she failed to uphold the image the king required. There is also the question of whether Catherine truly understood the implications of her actions. As a teenager surrounded by adults with competing agendas, she had little guidance. Her choices, particularly employing Derham and meeting with Culpeper, may have stemmed from fear, coercion, or desperation rather than calculated deceit. The lack of a protective support system, combined with Henry's mercurial temperament, left her defenseless. While the evidence suggests she exercised poor judgment, it is also clear that she was subjected to manipulation by men who saw her as a means to power. Historians today are more inclined to view Catherine with empathy, recognizing the limited agency she had in a patriarchal society that demanded virtue and submission from women while offering them few tools to protect themselves. Her brief life was shaped by the ambitions of others, from her family's attempts to gain favor at court to Henry's desire for youth and obedience. Once she failed to meet those expectations, she was cast aside and condemned. Catherine Howard's legacy is one of warning and sorrow. Her story reveals the dangers faced by young women in politically charged environments, especially when beauty and charm are valued more than character and wisdom. Her life reminds us of the human cost behind royal marriages and the devastating consequences of a court ruled by personal whims and political vendettas. Though often overshadowed by more prominent figures in Tudor history, Catherine's tragic fate continues to resonate as a poignant symbol of innocence betrayed and youth sacrificed to the ruthless demands of power. Catherine Parr, the survivor and scholar. Catherine Parr's life stands out among the wives of Henry VIII not for scandal or tragedy, but for her intellect, resilience, and remarkable survival in a treacherous court. She was Henry's sixth and final wife, a woman who managed to outlive him in a pattern where survival was anything but guaranteed. Her path to queenship, unlike those before her, was shaped not by youthful beauty or dynastic ambition, but by experience, education, and emotional strength. Before she ever met Henry, Catherine had already lived a full and complex life. Born in 1512 to Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, she came from a well-connected family with ties to the royal court. Her mother served as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and young Catherine was named in honor of the Spanish queen. Her early education reflected the humanist ideals gaining traction in England at the time. She was well versed in Latin and French, later studying Greek and theology, and was encouraged to think critically, a rarity for women in her era. Her intellect and curiosity marked her as different from many noblewomen of the time, who were more often educated in domestic skills than in scholarly pursuits. Catherine was twice widowed by the time she entered Henry's orbit. Her first marriage was to Sir Edward Berg, a politically insignificant union that ended in his early death. Her second husband, John Neville, Baron Latimer, was a wealthy and influential northern noble. Though significantly older than her, Latimer offered Catherine a comfortable home and a stepmotherly role to his children. During this marriage, she gained valuable experience managing a large household and navigating the religious upheaval of the 1530s, particularly during the Pilgrimage of Grace, a Catholic uprising that placed her family at risk. After Latimer's death in 1543, Catherine was again left a widow, but her status and intelligence had not gone unnoticed at court. At this stage in life, Catherine did not aspire to marry the king. In fact, she had fallen in love with Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour and a dashing courtier with ambitions of his own. But Henry VIII, now aging, ailing, and increasingly paranoid, had set his sights on her. For Catherine, the proposal was not only a command but also a profound moral and personal decision. She saw it as her duty to accept, even if it meant giving up her romantic aspirations. She married Henry in July 1543, becoming his sixth wife and the third to be named Catherine. Henry, suffering from severe health problems and paranoid about threats to his rule, was no easy husband. Catherine quickly learned to balance his volatile moods, provide companionship, and act as a competent regent when required. She became not only a wife but also a nurse and caretaker, tending to his ulcers and fragile health. More than this, she played a central role in unifying the fractured royal family. She formed genuine bonds with Henry's three children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, treating them with affection and advocating for their education and legitimacy. Her influence was particularly strong on Elizabeth, who would later become England's greatest monarch and was likely inspired by Catherine's intellectual and diplomatic prowess. Religiously, Catherine leaned toward Protestantism, embracing the reformist ideas that were spreading across Europe. She was a student of theology and even engaged in religious debates with the king. This was a bold move, given Henry's unpredictable stance on religion, which shifted dramatically throughout his reign. Catherine published devotional works and promoted the idea that women, too, could have a personal and learned relationship with God. However, these views made her enemies. Conservative factions at court, wary of her influence and reformist sympathies, began plotting against her. Led by powerful figures such as Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, her opponents sought to convince Henry that she was a heretic. In 1546, a warrant for Catherine's arrest was drawn up. The charges, based on her religious views, could have led to execution, the same fate that had befallen Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Catherine, however, demonstrated remarkable political acuity. Sensing the danger, she quickly moved to appease Henry, telling him that her debates with him had only been intended to distract him from his ailments and to learn from his superior wisdom. Flattered and mollified, Henry called off the arrest, even scolding those who had tried to turn him against her. It was a masterful act of survival, revealing Catherine's ability to maneuver in a deadly environment through intelligence and humility. Henry died in January 1547, leaving Catherine a widow once again. Unlike her previous widowhoods, This time she was free to pursue the love she had previously relinquished. Within months, she secretly married Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved before her marriage to the king. But what should have been a joyful union quickly descended into personal tragedy. Seymour was ambitious and reckless. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, and his attempts to gain influence over the young King Edward VI, Henry's son, caused tension within the Regency Council. During this time, Catherine also took in the young Princess Elizabeth, creating a household that could have been a haven of learning and support. However, Seymour's inappropriate behavior toward Elizabeth, who was around 14 years old at the time, cast a dark shadow over their home. Catherine, either unaware or in denial, tried to manage the situation delicately, but the strain was palpable. In 1548, Catherine became pregnant for the first and only time in her life. At 36, a relatively advanced age for childbirth in the Tudor period, this pregnancy was both a miracle and a risk. She gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, in September of that year, but the joy was short-lived. Catherine died from puerperal fever just days later, the same fate that had claimed Jane Seymour years before. Her death marked the end of a life filled with responsibility, endurance, and sacrifice. Her daughter would be taken into custody and eventually disappear from historical records, believed to have died in childhood. Catherine Parr's legacy endures not only as the wife who outlived Henry VIII, but as a woman who broke boundaries in a restrictive world. She was the first English queen to publish a book under her own name, writing religious texts that advocated for women's moral and spiritual education. Her works, including Prayers or Meditations and The Lamentation of a Sinner, were widely read and respected, contributing to the intellectual life of the English Reformation. She used her position not for personal gain but to advance education, tolerance, and religious reform. Catherine's life defies the simplistic narratives that often surround Henry VIII's wives. She was not merely the survivor but a learned, compassionate, and strategic figure who left a profound imprint on the Tudor court. Her contributions to the religious and intellectual culture of her time, her care for the royal children, and her deft navigation of court politics reveal a queen whose strength was rooted not in power but in wisdom. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine Parr's influence extended beyond her death through her writings, her stepchildren, and her embodiment of a new kind of queenship, one defined by intellect, not just beauty or fertility. Her story is a testament to resilience, intelligence, and quiet revolution in a world that offered few safe spaces for women, even queens. The story of Henry VIII is often told through his 6 wives, each woman representing a distinct phase in his life, reign, and personal transformation. But behind and around those prominent queens stood a network of women who wielded power in quieter, often more indirect ways. These women, mothers, sisters, daughters, ladies-in-waiting and rivals, were not simply background figures but vital participants in the politics, ambitions, and emotional drama that defined Henry's court. Their influence, while sometimes subtle, shaped the decisions that reverberated through English history. In the royal court, mothers held an especially critical role. From the very beginning, Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, set a precedent. As the unifying figure between the warring houses of York and Lancaster, her marriage to Henry VII solidified the Tudor claim to the throne. Though Elizabeth herself died when Henry was still a child, her presence lingered in the mythos of Tudor legitimacy. The maternal lineage was critical for any consort. A queen consort's value was deeply tied to her ability to provide heirs. Catherine of Aragon's mother, Isabella of Castile, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, was a formidable political figure and symbol of dynastic strength. Catherine carried her mother's legacy with her, embodying both royal dignity and Catholic devotion. Beyond mothers, female relatives of nobility also played significant political and social roles. The Howard family, for instance, wielded considerable power through their women. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were both related to the ambitious Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Their presence at court was no accident. These women were carefully groomed and positioned as pawns in a larger family strategy aimed at securing influence through proximity to the king. Their downfalls were not just personal tragedies but political failures for their entire families. Sisters and daughters, too, contributed to the complex tapestry of Tudor power. Mary Tudor, Henry's sister, was a crucial piece in his early diplomatic plans when she was married off to the aging King Louis XII of France. Her later rebellion in marrying Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, without Henry's permission, tested the limits of royal authority and familial loyalty. Mary's defiance foreshadowed the tensions that would later erupt around Henry's own daughters. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth both lived through the disgrace of their mothers, were declared illegitimate, and yet managed to survive the dangerous politics of succession. These women, especially Elizabeth, learned from their observations, watching their father manipulate and discard queens with devastating ease. The strength, caution, and brilliance Elizabeth would later show as queen were forged in those early years of uncertainty and observation. Among the most dynamic figures in Henry's court were the ladies-in-waiting, noblewomen who attended the queen and were often involved in the court's most delicate intrigues. These women were far from passive. They carried messages, participated in matchmaking, and served as both confidants and spies. It was often through these women that affairs began, rumors spread, or alliances were cemented. For instance, Jane Seymour first caught Henry's attention while serving Anne Boleyn. Similarly, Catherine Howard's past relationships, including those within her own household, came back to destroy her due to the intimate knowledge possessed by her servants and companions. The court was a place of constant surveillance and ambition, and women had to be skilled players in order to survive. Rivalries among these women were not just personal but ideological. Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn represented different religious and political visions for England. Their struggle for Henry's favor was also a battle between Catholic orthodoxy and Protestant reform. Their respective supporters formed factions within the court, and their enmity spilled into national policy and religious revolution. Similarly, the brief reign of Anne of Cleves, and her diplomatic usefulness, was largely influenced by the machinations of male and female courtiers who sought to either uphold or dissolve the alliance depending on shifting religious alliances. As much as these women were bound by their roles as consorts or courtiers, they also had moments of real agency. Anne Boleyn's refusal to become just another mistress led to the English Reformation. Catherine Parr's theological writings subtly advanced Protestant ideas. Even Anne of Cleves, dismissed by Henry as unattractive, managed to secure her independence and financial security by gracefully accepting the annulment and positioning herself as a sisterly figure. These women, in navigating personal danger and public scrutiny, shaped the dynamics of power in Tudor England far beyond their official roles. Over the decades of Henry's reign, his view of love, women, and power changed dramatically. In his youth, Henry was a romantic idealist. His early marriage to Catherine of Aragon was built on diplomatic strategy but also genuine affection. He was athletic, charismatic, and eager to fulfill the chivalric image of a Renaissance prince. Women, in this phase of his life, were idealized as noble, virtuous, and central to the production of legitimate heirs. His court was filled with music, poetry, and flirtation, reflections of a king who viewed love as both political and poetic. This romanticism eroded as the realities of failed pregnancies and the absence of a male heir took their toll. Henry's obsession with fathering a son became all-consuming. Each marriage that failed to produce the desired male successor further eroded his patience and deepened his mistrust. Anne Boleyn's inability to give him a surviving son, combined with her assertiveness, marked a turning point. His love soured into suspicion and cruelty, ultimately leading to her execution. From this point forward, his relationships became less about passion and more about control, legacy, and political convenience. His experience with each wife reshaped his attitudes. With Jane Seymour, who gave him the long-awaited son, he found brief peace, only to lose her to childbirth. Her memory became sanctified, not because she challenged him, but because she gave him what he wanted and died before any conflict could emerge. This loss, perhaps, solidified in Henry the belief that submission and fertility were the defining virtues of a queen. Anne of Cleves' rejection based on appearance was driven not only by superficial disgust, but also by a deeper psychological need to dominate his marital arrangements. By the time he married Catherine Howard, his behavior bordered on obsessive. She was young and energetic, perhaps reminding him of the youth and vigor he had lost. But her infidelity, real or suspected, shattered whatever illusions he had left. Henry's health during this time cannot be overlooked. Suffering from a painful leg ulcer, weight gain, and possible complications from diabetes or other conditions, he became increasingly paranoid, irritable, and tyrannical. His ego, once tied to his physical prowess, now relied on absolute obedience and reverence from those around him. Love no longer meant affection, it meant loyalty without question. His final marriage to Catherine Parr was marked more by political and emotional necessity than desire. She was a caregiver, a stabilizing force, and ultimately someone who could manage the business of kingship while he faded into infirmity. Beneath the personal relationships, there existed a deeper shift in how Henry connected love and power. Initially, love was a way to humanize authority, a king who could woo, marry, and cherish a partner. Over time, love became a test of loyalty and usefulness. If a queen could not deliver an heir, or if she questioned his authority, she was not just unworthy, she was dangerous. His wives went from partners to pawns, and affection became conditional on obedience and performance. This evolution reflected a broader change in his kingship. As his insecurities grew, he surrounded himself with flatterers and informants. The execution of wives became an extension of his political ruthlessness, a stark warning to anyone who dared oppose him. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the handsome, golden-haired prince of his youth but a bloated, ailing monarch whose relationships bore the scars of betrayal, disappointment, and fear. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had survived the revolving door of queens and the instability that came with their father's changing affections. They learned that power, for a woman in their world, was fleeting and dangerous, but also that survival required adaptation, intellect, and resilience. The evolution of Henry's romantic and political life mirrored the transformation of his reign from early optimism to later authoritarianism. His pursuit of love turned into a quest for control, and the women he married bore the brunt of his growing volatility. Yet within that story, the women around him, his wives, mothers, daughters, and courtiers, proved to be more than just victims or pawns. They were players in a high-stakes game, capable of both influence and endurance. Their legacies, long overshadowed by Henry's larger-than-life image, deserve recognition not just for their personal suffering but for their contributions to the shaping of Tudor history. The 6 wives of Henry VIII have become some of the most famous women in history, not just because of their roles in Tudor England, but because of the way they have been portrayed in popular culture over the centuries. From dramatic television shows and best-selling historical fiction to stage musicals and films, these women have often been simplified, romanticized, or vilified in ways that obscure the more complex truths of their lives. These portrayals have helped to keep their stories alive in the public imagination, but they have also created myths that often do a disservice to the real historical women behind them. Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous of Henry's wives, has long been depicted as a cunning seductress who used her charm and ambition to steal a king from his devoted wife. In many adaptations, she is portrayed as either a cold political operator or a wicked temptress whose downfall was the natural result of her manipulation. Series like The Tudors or novels like The Other Boleyn Girl have contributed to an enduring image of Anne as calculating and dangerous. Yet these representations overlook key aspects of her character and context. Anne was a well-educated woman with strong opinions, deeply invested in the religious reform that reshaped England. Her refusal to become just another royal mistress, her influence in promoting Protestant ideas, and her independent spirit made her a target in a male-dominated court. Her story is not merely about ambition, but also about a woman who challenged the rules of power, and paid for it with her life. Catherine Howard, too, suffers from a reductive image in popular culture. Often cast as a foolish, promiscuous teenager who brought her fate upon herself, she is rarely shown as the vulnerable and exploited young woman that history reveals. Many depictions paint her as giggly, flirtatious, and unaware of the stakes around her. Yet Catherine, likely no older than 16 or 17 when she married a king in his 50s, had very little formal education or preparation for her role as queen. The environment of her early years was not one of moral guidance but of neglect and exploitation. The adults around her failed her repeatedly, and her flirtations and past relationships were judged with a cruelty that ignored her age and the context of her upbringing. Instead of being viewed as a victim of power and circumstance, she is frequently remembered as the architect of her own destruction. Another myth that distorts a deeper and more troubling truth. Jane Seymour, in contrast, has been memorialized as the perfect queen, gentle, obedient, and angelic. She is often presented as the ideal Tudor wife, especially because she gave Henry his longed-for male heir and died soon after, before she could ever fall from favor. In fiction and film, Jane is usually portrayed in white, associated with purity, selflessness, and quiet strength. This vision of her contrasts sharply with the controversial women who came before and after her. Yet, historical records show that Jane was not simply a passive figure. She came from a powerful family and was likely encouraged to catch the king's eye for political reasons. She involved herself in political matters, especially in advocating for the restoration of Princess Mary to the line of succession. Her behavior reflected the careful calculation needed to survive at Henry's court, not just sweetness and submission. Reducing her to a saintly image strips away the intelligence and political awareness she had to possess in order to succeed, even briefly, in such a dangerous environment. These romanticized or villainous portrayals are not new. The way we understand these queens has always been shaped by the politics and prejudices of the times. But more recently, feminist historians, writers, and creators have begun to re-examine these women through a different lens. This movement seeks not only to rescue their reputations from centuries of misogyny, but also to restore their agency and individuality. These queens were not merely defined by their relationships with Henry VIII. They were thinkers, patrons, political actors, and survivors navigating one of the most perilous courts in European history. Feminist rereadings question long-held assumptions. They ask whether Anne Boleyn's ambition was really more dangerous than the political ambitions of the men around her, or if her downfall was a product of fear over a woman who dared to speak too boldly. They consider Catherine Howard not as a moral failure, but as a teenager manipulated by adults and exploited in a system that treated women's bodies as bargaining chips. They explore how Catherine of Aragon's firm refusal to bow to Henry's annulment was not stubbornness, but a principled stand grounded in both personal conviction and legal precedent. This approach also highlights how court manipulation shaped these women's lives. They were constantly observed, judged, and caught in power plays between factions. Men like Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Howard, and others had their own agendas, and the queens were often pawns or obstacles. Letters, court documents, and ambassadorial reports reveal how these women were discussed and managed by the powerful men surrounding them. Their decisions and reputations were not shaped in isolation, but in a court rife with ambition, betrayal, and religious tension. Looking beyond narrative fiction and popular media, the historical record provides a more grounded, if sometimes fragmented, portrait of these women. Letters written by the queens, portraits commissioned during their lifetimes, and official records like trial transcripts and royal proclamations offer vital insights into their characters and circumstances. Catherine of Aragon's many letters, for example, show her eloquence, piety, and unwavering dignity during her long battle to remain queen. Anne Boleyn's surviving correspondence is limited, but diplomatic reports reflect a woman who was sharp, confident, and capable of holding her own in conversation and debate. Portraits also offer subtle clues. While often idealized, they can hint at how a queen wished to be seen, or how others wanted her presented. Jane Seymour's portrait by Hans Holbein depicts her in rich but modest clothing, her gaze direct but unchallenging, reinforcing the narrative of the virtuous mother. Anne of Cleves' famously misleading portrait contributed to the myth that she tricked Henry with her looks, when in reality, it was his expectations and discomfort with foreign customs that caused the breakdown of their marriage. Portraiture was a tool of both propaganda and legacy, shaping how these women were viewed by their contemporaries and by future generations. The written records of trials and investigations are especially revealing, though they must be read critically. The accusations against Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were filled with inconsistencies and driven by political motives. Yet, for centuries, these documents were accepted as factual, fueling portrayals of these women as guilty or corrupt. Modern historians have revisited these sources, exposing their flaws and offering alternative interpretations that reflect more compassion and context. The contrast between myth and reality becomes even more striking when we consider the legacy these women left behind. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, became one of England's greatest monarchs. Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was the first woman to rule England in her own right. Both were shaped by the public treatment of their mothers and learned to navigate a world that had repeatedly dismissed and destroyed powerful women. Their reigns were a testament to the endurance and influence of women once viewed as expendable. Ultimately, the way these queens are remembered reveals more about the times in which the stories were told than about the women themselves. For centuries, they were symbols of virtue or sin, loyalty or betrayal, fertility or failure. Today, the challenge lies in peeling back those symbolic layers to see the individuals behind them. They were not just the wives of Henry VIII. They were political actors, cultural figures, and human beings living through extraordinary circumstances. As historians, readers, and viewers, we owe it to them to move beyond myth and embrace the complexity of their lives and legacies. The stories of Henry VIII's 6 wives extend far beyond their individual lives. Together, they form a powerful and lasting legacy that continues to shape our understanding of monarchy, gender, and power. These women, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, were more than just consorts or victims of a volatile king's passions. They were central figures in the transformation of England's political, religious, and cultural landscape, and their influence echoes through the reigns of their children and beyond. At the heart of their legacy is the profound impact they had on the English monarchy. Henry VIII's reign marked a dramatic shift in the relationship between the crown and religion, society, and governance. The personal was inseparable from the political, and the Queen's lives were deeply entwined with the major events that shaped Tudor England. Catherine of Aragon's steadfast resistance to Henry's desire to annul their marriage triggered the English Reformation, as Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church to assert his supremacy. This seismic shift was not only about Henry's marital status but about the birth of a new national church, which would define English identity for centuries. Anne Boleyn's role in this religious revolution was equally critical. Her marriage to Henry was not just a personal union but a catalyst for reform and political realignment. She championed Protestant ideas and helped lay the groundwork for England's religious transformation. Though her downfall was brutal, Anne's influence persisted in the cultural and political fabric of the nation, especially through her daughter Elizabeth I, who would rule with a deft balance of religious moderation and political strength. Jane Seymour, often remembered as the mother of Henry's only legitimate male heir, Edward VI, also shaped the monarchy's future. Her death following childbirth cemented her status as the king's favorite wife and symbolized the importance of producing a male successor in a patriarchal society. Edward's brief reign continued the Protestant reforms begun under his father, and his legacy, though short-lived, was a testament to Jane's central place in Tudor dynastic ambitions. The influence of the later queens, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, might seem less grandiose at first glance, but each contributed uniquely to the monarchy's evolution. And of Cleves' pragmatic acceptance of annulment and her continued presence at court highlighted the importance of diplomacy and survival in royal marriages. Catherine Howard's tragic youth and execution revealed the brutal realities of court politics, the vulnerabilities of women under patriarchal rule, and the deadly consequences of scandal. Meanwhile, Catherine Parr's role as Henry's last wife and her intellectual contributions underscored the increasing prominence of education, religion, and female agency in the Tudor court. The daughters born from these unions, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each carried forward a complicated inheritance shaped by their mother's experiences. Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, became the first reigning Queen of England. Her attempts to restore Catholicism and her controversial reign earned her the moniker Bloody Mary, but she also demonstrated the challenges a woman faced ruling in a male-dominated world rife with religious conflict. Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, is perhaps the most famous Tudor monarch, ruling for over 4 decades and ushering in a golden age of English culture, exploration, and political stability. Her reign was marked by careful negotiation of power, balancing religious factions and navigating the pressures of being a female sovereign in a patriarchal society. Edward VI, Jane Seymour's son, though young and short-lived as king, continued the Protestant legacy and was instrumental in shaping England's religious future. These children's reigns reflect not only their individual capabilities but also the enduring shadows cast by their mothers' lives and the turbulent court they inherited. The Queen's triumphs and tragedies revealed the precarious nature of female power in Tudor England, how their value was often measured by fertility, obedience, and political utility, and how quickly their fortunes could reverse due to the whims of a king or court intrigue. Looking at the lives of Henry's wives also provides crucial insight into the broader themes of patriarchy, politics, and survival. The Tudor court was a place where women's bodies and loyalties were tightly controlled by male authority. The Queen's marriages were political alliances, but these women often had little agency over their own fates. Their stories underscore how women, regardless of rank, navigated a world dominated by male power structures that both elevated and endangered them. They were expected to be symbols of dynastic stability yet were expendable if they failed to meet the king's demands. At the same time, the queens were not mere passive victims. They exercised influence, negotiated their positions, and at times shaped policy and religious direction. Catherine Parr's scholarly pursuits and patronage, Anne Boleyn's religious convictions, and Catherine of Aragon's legal and diplomatic resistance all demonstrate the complex ways these women engaged with power. Their survival required intelligence, resilience, and adaptability in an environment rife with danger. Henry's treatment of his wives reflects the broader patterns of power and control characteristic of his reign. His obsession with producing a male heir was both a personal desire and a political necessity, but it also revealed his insecurities and authoritarian tendencies. His wives' fates, from divorce to execution, highlight the brutal limits of female agency under a monarch who wielded his power with increasing ruthlessness. Their stories serve as a lens through which to examine the intersection of gender, authority, and survival in one of history's most infamous courts. Ultimately, the legacy of these 6 women is inseparable from the legacy of Henry VIII himself. Through their lives, we glimpse the turbulent transformations of Tudor England, the religious upheaval, the shifting political alliances, and the precarious position of women in a male-dominated society. Their influence endures not only in the history of the monarchy but in the broader narrative of female resilience and power in a world that often sought to silence or erase them. Their stories remind us that history is never just about kings and battles, but about the people, especially women, who shaped events in subtle but profound ways. The 6 wives of Henry VIII continue to captivate our imaginations, not because of their tragic ends or romantic intrigues alone, but because they represent the complexities of survival, love, and power in an unforgiving era. Their legacy invites us to look beyond myth and legend to the real women who helped shape a nation's history and whose impact resonates to this day.